They call it the Rebel City. Cork earned that name 500 years ago when its mayor followed a fake king to England and lost his head for it. The name stuck because Cork never stopped fighting. A monastery burned 3 times by Vikings, a plague that killed half the town in a single year, a harbour where 2.5 million people said goodbye to Ireland and never came back. 2 Lord Mayors murdered within months of each other. And a night in December 1920 when British forces set the city centre on fire and shot at the firemen trying to save it. This is Cork, a city built on a marsh, destroyed over and over and rebuilt every time. Long before the Vikings, long before the Normans, long before the English, Cork began with one man and a marsh. Around the year 600, a monk named Finbarr walked the length of the River Lee from his hermitage at Gugambara in the mountains of West Cork to the place where the river meets the sea. There, where the Lee splits into 2 slow channels and the land dissolves into a maze of low marshy islands, he founded a monastery. The Irish called the place Corcai, the Marsh. It was an unlikely place to build anything. The ground was soft, the air thick with river fog, the tides unpredictable. But the marshes gave protection, and the river gave access to the sea. Finbarr's monastery grew into a centre of learning that drew monks and students from across the south of Ireland. For over 200 years, it stood in relative peace, a small community of prayer, scholarship and quiet trade, surrounded by water and silence on the edge of the known world. That peace ended in 820 when the first Viking longships appeared on the River Lee. The Norsemen raided Cork's monastery for the first time around 820. They came back and burned it again and again. But the Vikings were not just destroyers, they were traders. By 915, a new wave of Scandinavians had settled on the marshy islands of the Lee and founded a permanent trading port. They built wooden houses on raised platforms to keep above the tides. And they began to trade. English salt, French wine, furs. The monastery had no access to these goods on its own, so the monks and the Vikings reached an understanding. They would coexist. The Norsemen traded, the monks prayed, and for 2 centuries Cork survived as a small but connected outpost on the edge of the Atlantic world. Viking Cork was never large. It had no stone walls, no great defences. But it had a harbour, and that harbour linked it to a trading network that stretched from Scandinavia to France. Families with names like Cotter and Coppinger traced their roots back to these Norse settlers. By the 12th century, Cork's Hiberno Vikings had intermarried with the Irish, spoken the language and become Christian. In 1173, when the Normans arrived, Cork's last Viking leader gathered a fleet of 32 ships to fight them off. He lost. The Normans took Cork and everything changed again. The Normans who took Cork in the 1170s did what the Vikings never had. They built stone walls. By the 13th century, Cork was a walled city on an island, 2 channels of the River Lee running on either side, stone gates to the north and south, and inside a cramped settlement of roughly 2,000 people. It was an English outpost surrounded by hostile Gaelic territory, cut off from Dublin and the Pale. The Irish lords outside the walls demanded protection money, they called it black rent, and the city paid because the alternative was worse. Cork's wealth came from trade. A handful of merchant families, no more than 12 or 15, controlled everything. They exported wool and animal hides to continental Europe and imported salt, iron and wine. It was enough to keep the city alive, but Cork was always fragile. In 1349, the Black Death arrived. Nearly half the population was dead within a year. Cork survived, but barely. And then, a century and a half later, the city earned the name it would carry forever. In 1491, a man named Perkin Warbeck arrived, claiming to be the rightful king of England. The mayor of Cork believed him. He and several prominent citizens followed Warbeck to England to overthrow the king. The rebellion collapsed. They were all captured and executed. From that moment on, Cork was the rebel city. For 300 years, Cork had kept its walls up and its head down, an English-speaking trading town paying protection money to survive in Gaelic Ireland. But the 16th century brought something the walls could not keep out: religion. The Tudor conquest forced the Protestant Reformation on a Catholic country. In Cork, the monasteries of the Franciscans, Augustinians and Dominicans were shut down and their property seized. Outside the walls, Munster burned. The Desmond rebellions tore the province apart, and thousands of refugees flooded into Cork, bringing plague with them. In 1601, a Spanish fleet of 3,500 soldiers landed at Kinsale, just 20 miles south of Cork, to support an Irish rebellion against the English crown. Cork sided with England. The Spanish were defeated, but religion would not go away. 2 years later, the citizens of Cork revolted, not for independence, not for an Irish king, but for the right to remain Catholic. They expelled Protestant ministers, seized weapons, and barred the English army from entering the city. It did not last. The ringleaders were arrested, and English control was restored. Half a century later, Cromwell came to Ireland. Cork surrendered without a fight, the Catholic townspeople were expelled, and for the next 200 years, the city would be ruled by a Protestant minority. In 1690, the walls that had protected Cork for 5 centuries were finally destroyed, blown apart by English artillery during a 5-day siege. The medieval city was over. Butter and Empire. What rose from the ruins was a different city. The marshes that had defined Cork for 1,000 years were drained and filled. New streets appeared where water had been. St. Patrick's Street, the main thoroughfare of modern Cork, was a river channel until 1780. Georgian townhouses replaced medieval timber. Cork was being reinvented, and at the centre of this transformation was butter. In the 18th century, Cork became the largest butter market in the world. Farmers from across Munster brought their produce to the butter exchange in Shandon, where it was inspected, graded and packed into oak casks for export. From Cork's harbour, salted butter and beef were shipped to Britain, France, the Caribbean and the American colonies. By 1774, Cork controlled nearly 90% of all Irish butter exports to America. The money poured in, new churches went up. St. Anne's Shandon in the 1720s, its bells still ringing over the city today. A custom house was built. Breweries and distilleries opened along the river. Cork was no longer a walled outpost clinging to survival. It was a prosperous trading city, its harbour one of the busiest in the British Isles. But prosperity had a dark side. Much of the beef and butter shipped from Cork fed the slave plantations of the Caribbean, and the wealth stayed in the hands of a Protestant merchant class, while the Catholic majority lived in growing poverty. By the 1840s, Cork's population had reached 80,000, many of them crammed into overcrowded slums. The city was a powder keg, and the famine was coming. In 1845, the potato blight struck Ireland for the first time. Within a year, the harvest had almost entirely failed. For the millions of Irish poor who depended on a single crop to survive, it was a death sentence. Cork was hit brutally. Thousands of starving people flooded into the city from the surrounding countryside, looking for food, for work, for any way out. The population of the county dropped by almost a quarter in a single decade, from over 850,000 to 650,000. The dead were buried in mass graves. The living walked to the harbour. From the port of Queenstown, today called Cobh, ships carried the desperate across the Atlantic. Over 2.5 million people would eventually leave through that harbour, making it the single most important port of emigration in all of Ireland. On New Year's Day, 1892, a teenage girl from County Cork named Annie Moore stepped off a ship and became the first immigrant ever processed at the New Ellis Island station in New York. She was given a $10 gold coin. She never left the slums of the Lower East Side. Annie Moore's story was the story of Cork's famine emigrants. They did not find streets paved with gold. They found tenements, factory floors, and early graves. But they kept coming, because behind them was something worse. Today, statues of Annie and her 2 brothers stand on the quayside at Cobh, looking out across the harbour, facing the direction their ship once sailed. The famine reshaped Irish politics. By the early 20th century, a growing independence movement had taken hold across the country, and Cork was one of its centres. In 1919, the Irish War of Independence began. a guerrilla conflict between the Irish Republican Army and British forces. In 1920, Cork became its most violent battlefield. In March, the Lord Mayor of Cork was shot dead in his home by members of the Royal Irish Constabulary, the British police force in Ireland. It was his 36th birthday. His wife and child were in the house. The coroner's inquest returned a verdict of willful murder against the British Prime Minister. His successor, as Lord Mayor, was arrested 5 months later and imprisoned in London. He refused all food and died in Brixton Prison on the 25th of October after 74 days on hunger strike. The death drew international attention. The violence escalated on both sides. On the 28th of November, 36 IRA volunteers ambushed a British patrol near Kilmichael, west of Cork. 17 were killed, the single largest British loss of the war. 2 weeks later, the IRA ambushed another patrol inside the city at Dillon's Cross, killing 1 and wounding 12. That same night, the 11th of December 1920, British forces entered the centre of Cork in reprisal. Over the following hours, they looted businesses, set fires across the city centre and destroyed St. Patrick's Street, the City Hall and the Carnegie Library. Firefighters who attempted to control the blaze reported that their hoses were cut and that they were fired upon. 2 unarmed men were shot dead in their home. By morning, over 5 acres of the city had been destroyed and more than 2,000 people had lost their jobs. The British government initially denied responsibility. A military inquiry identified members of the auxiliary police force as responsible, but the report was never published. No one was held accountable. Cork had been called the Rebel City since 1491. After December 1920, the name held a different weight.